Hello, I'm Jacqueline Holstead, and you are listening to On Point Conversations. In this podcast series, we share creative marketing, content, and branding strategies that help your business successfully navigate the new normal marketing environment. Hi, and I am Jacqueline Holstead, and today I've got several topics that I'm going to talk about, and they flow in together a little bit differently, but they do flow together. I want to continue my discussion on change management, and this time I'm going to talk about the R's of change management, which might make it easier to remember, and if not, you can always go back to my podcast, which is posted on all different kinds of platforms. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the bank issue that happened this week, because I'm not a banker. I'm also not a financial person. Of course, I handle financial things for my business, and I talk through things with my clients about financial obligations and costs for projects and things. But since the big headline this week was that two top 20 largest U.S. banks collapsed, and that was Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, at the end of this podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened from my perspective and what that means and what you might do. And these are all up to you, and you should be talking to a financial expert, by the way, or a financial specialist, particularly if this affects your business, even your private account, but I'm going to be talking to you about in business terms. So let's first talk about the R's of change management. So last week I said I gave you 14 questions to ask before you made the changes. And this is another approach here. It's actually a little bit more scaled down because I thought that was a lot to think about. And it's pretty basic anyway, because you want to know if the change is going to bring you a benefit, your customers or your company a benefit, and what it's going to take to make that change, and whether the change is necessary or not. So there are all those questions. So let's start from the beginning again and just go through some of the questions that I pulled together for you. First of all, you might look at who requested the change. Now, this is really important, just to put the changes or change in context of kind of importance and a priority. Now, obviously, we know that if the CEO brings the change, most managers will be hesitant to either disregard or challenge it, depending on the culture that the CEO is developing or has developed. However, no matter where the change idea comes from, whether it's staff, the C-suite, the CEO, customer, it should be evaluated for the need to make the change. Is there a necessity? Is it a priority? And what do you find is the outcome? Is it going to improve your product? Is it going to improve your customer relationship? Is it going to improve your staff relationship? Is it going to include and change your product production, your product improvements themselves? So first of all, think about who requested the change. And then the second is, what is the reason for the change? And that's a question you can ask the person or people who identified the change, because once you know the reasons or reason, then you can evaluate better the effect. You can evaluate the ease of making change happen, or whether it's even needed or not. So sending this back and looking at who requested the change, and then talking about what the reason for the change is. And there might be more than one reason. There might be just one reason, and one reason might be enough to make the change. So ask about that. What's the reason? And what is the return expected? And then what's the required from the change? So it's based really on, is it a product improvement? Is it staff morale? So what is this change expected to return? What's the return going to be as a benefit to those affected? And please include your customer or end user in this thinking too. And then what's required? So, and put them into measurable terms. What is the return expected? And that's what's required to make the change. So let's say the change costs $40,000 because maybe it's a software change, it's an upgrade, there's things that happen, you have training involved, you have other aspects involved. Will it return that investment in dollars or value if that change is made? So some of the issues will be defined by how you think about it, how you feel about it, and then number of changes will be defined by hard numbers. What are you going to expect to return from this change? And what's required to make the change? Do you have to add people? Do you have to add consultants? Do you have to have all new training? And thinking about all the aspects of the changes. When we talk about change, and I do, this is anything that can change. And we're going to go back as soon as I'm done with this part. I want to talk about the bank and the bank changes that happened this week and some of the things you might change in your thinking. So changes can be in a way of thinking. They can be in planning. They can be in infrastructure. They can be with regards to relationships. So changes come in all forms. So when you're thinking about that, then you can better find and expect what the expected return is and then what's required to change. Now, there are always risks. It doesn't matter what it is. Well, unless it's a tiny, tiny change. But what are the risks involved in the change? Many times larger changes, even smaller changes, can involve a risk. And whether the risk is taken to get the change in place and whether you agree to that or you want that, or there's maybe a risk with branding or the consumer, just think really deeply as you can about the negative side of the change. Most people want to think of the positive side, and this is going to be really good, and this is going to help. But kind of think of what your risks are. So you've got kind of a risk assessment, and take time to do that also back with the person or the person's staff who requested the change. In addition, what resources are required to deliver the change? And when we think of resources, we're thinking money, investment, people resources. Did you need to hire consultants or a consultant? Do you need to add people? Do you need to add buildings? Do you need to add training? What do you need? What resources are you required to deliver the change? And do you have those resources internally to your company, or will you have to go outside to get those? And then lastly, who's responsible for the build, test, and implementation of the change? All of the changes and things that come from the top going down or wherever they come from, there's a responsibility in the company at some point to implement the change. So now you've gone through who requested the change, which seems like almost the least amount of weight in this particular area, but who requested the change? What's the reason for the change? What return do you expect? And then what return is required for you to make the change? What are the risks involved in this particular change? For example, I think of the risks of, do you want to expand your business to another locale, another territory, add another location? What are the risks involved in that change? And you might be finding lots of risks, but you might also feel that the outcome is going to be overcome the risks that are needed to take this particular step. What resources are required to deliver the change? And again, we talk money. Of course, money comes in, investment, people. What are you going to need? And do you have those internally? As an entrepreneur in my business, I have to think about what resources that I might have to hire, that I might have to use. And I look both, it isn't always a dollar for dollar thing either. It might be that it's going to make the process that I do much more smoothly, going more smoothly. It might form a better relationship with my customers. Some of that is not always so developed as a cut and dry money or investment, but it's also in how's it going to help my company have a better reputation, a better brand, build upon itself, move quickly or into the market, maybe a new market. So looking at that's important. And who's responsible for the build, test, and implementation? Which I find that sometimes is a very, very big stumbling block, because you want to define who in your company is responsible. And sometimes, many times, that's a team. because it might be a bigger change, and now you're going to need a bigger change to build and test and implement. And you want those people to have the kind of feedback that they can bring back about this change, that there's a feedback loop. And make that feedback loop easy to do, but not only that, consistent, and don't take too long a period of time. Yes, change takes time. Yes, sometimes there'll be pitfalls, but staying on top of that with your staff and your team will make them less frustrated with the process. If they see that, it'll make them more open to saying, here's something that we need to change in this change. So it allows people to implement the change. And if you don't want to implement the change, then you shouldn't even start the change. So often when a change is updated or initiated by upper management, it might not be billed and tested for positive implementation, but rather delegated to make this change, or your job's in jeopardy. Really, it's important to have a feedback loop. I just mentioned that a minute ago. It also has to be an open type of a company that has a culture where they're willing to listen. If the feedback is not positive, they're willing to listen to that. And sometimes the feedback won't be positive, but it can be addressed. And if it's addressed, it might be just that feedback then can be taken, it's addressed, the person felt listened to, and then you move on, because sometimes, change has a bumpy road to it. Now, in this particular week, because I want to touch on this, you might have heard over the weekend kind of the chaos and concern surrounding Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. So I wanted to address those today, and those can be changes to your company. So you might want to go back to what I just said and look at how you might implement some changes there. But I wanted to make sure I shared some events coupled with some of my thoughts on it. So I'm not, again, in the financial area as it would be a CFO, but I am in the financial area, and that I want to keep my company solvent, and I want to make sure I don't lose money. So the headline this week was that 2 top 20 largest U.S. banks collapse. That was, again, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. Now, these are not small banks. So what really happened, and this is from my perspective, from reading the different articles that were out in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and various articles. It appears that both banks broke the first rule of sound financial health, and that they didn't have enough in savings. SVB, which is kind of the Silicon Valley Bank, they became really a top U.S. bank by lending to startup companies. And we know that startup companies are iffy. Sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. And in 2021, tech companies were really flush with cash. That was due to COVID and really low interest rates. So SVB agreed to be their bank. They agreed to be the startup bank. They took the cash and they invested in various types of bonds, including heavy positions in mortgage-backed bonds. Now, since then, we know that the interest rates have increased dramatically. And when interest rates go up, lower paying bond values like the ones SVB invested in tend to go down, which is exactly what happens. So all of a sudden, SVB's investments were losing value. And when the investors caught on, it caused a panic. And ultimately what we call a bank run, people go to withdraw their funds. Then the problem was that the SVB bank didn't have their money. That's what happened with the collapse. Now, you might be very aware of this, but if you're not, only $250,000 is FDIC insured, and the rest could be lost. So look at that when you're looking at your business. Where are you keeping your assets? And you might want if you don't already have, a financial consultant to help you move those funds around a little bit so they're not all in one area. So what does this mean? So some people will say, well, it's 2008 and 2009 all over again, but not necessarily. And others will say it's not necessarily it either. But it does confirm that our economy is not in a really great place at present day. I think we pretty much can figure that out from the news and other things. And we don't know if other banks are going to follow suit. We're going to only know when time takes time and effort to see what happens. But the feds have been aggressive in providing relief to avoid widespread panic. You might have heard President Biden talk yesterday. I think it was yesterday I heard him talk on the a radio about, getting rid of firing the top management or the management of this bank, coming in and being FDIC insured for those people who have up to $250,000 in that bank. What the recommendation is don't panic. Be calm, cautiously optimistic, and be prepared. Now, being prepared with your business might be different than your personal. I know that. But you might even go back to what I talked about change in the beginning of this podcast to talk about how you're going to handle and be prepared for what might happen in the future. So we've talked about this before. In 2000, we talked about having an emergency fund, which should include a minimum of 3 months worth of expenses. So 3 months worth of expenses for your business or personal. I like to keep at least that much. And the 2 months, and have a month and 2 months in a liquid bank account. In other words, a total of 3 months worth of expenses. If that means moving money around, I'll do that. But we now know that, we want to have at least that for our businesses. You really want to build towards 6 months worth of expenses. Now, most companies will say, well, we have that. We're fine with there. But smaller companies sometimes don't, and startups might not. So as you build your staff, you might look at that. Will I be able to go 6 months worth of expenses without going bankrupt or having to close my company? Never keep more than $250,000 of cash in one bank. Now that FDIC's coverage is per bank. In times of uncertainty, you might want to consider banking with the big banks. And, it's an unfortunate truth that some banks are kind of too big to fail, and the government tends to protect and bail them out, but that's not always true. But typically, they're more robust than local banks. And again, you can argue with that particular point. I don't know for sure, but I prefer banking myself with bigger banks. But I do have some things in some smaller banks because I like the interest rates, and I think I like their service. As you make contributions to IRAs, consider the Roth IRA contributions if you're eligible, as Roth IRA contributions can be withdrawn penalty and tax-free, and thus act as a last resort emergency fund if absolutely necessary during turbulent economic conditions. And schedule time with someone to go through your financial plan. Because these are just general things that I'm giving you. Again, I'm not a financial consultant. I don't stand by these as far as, this is exactly the way things go. You might want to do and schedule. And that goes back to when you make these changes, you look at what your risks are, you look at resources, and you look at the return, and you look at the reason for the change. And maybe you have no reason to change at all. So I've been giving you some ideas that I've got from different sources. You can also look those up. The New York Times has an article online called 3 Lessons from Silicon Valley's Banks Failures. Look that up. There's another one on morningbrew.com called U.S. Regulators Give Silicon Valley Bank Depositors Access to All of Their Funds to Avert Banking Crisis. There are different Congress people that have been talking about. There's certainly a lot to talk about. And I'm only giving you very top level look at it from my perspective again. And again, as you're making changes, one of the things you look at is who is giving you that information. And I'm telling you up front that I'm not a financial person. I'm just looking at it this way. But I do think that your business should be, if it isn't already, using a financial consultant to help you, particularly if you have more funds that you've got in certain banks or in certain areas. That's all I have for you today. I appreciate your time. I hope this helped you, and I hope that you have a really, really good day. Thank you for listening, and I invite you to join me next week as we talk more about specific actions you can take to reach your own business goals. You can find my library of other inspiring podcasts like this one at onpointthinking.com. Again, thank you for listening. This is Jacqueline Holstead at On Point Conversations.